Here, thank you, Zoom. Right, so welcome everyone to this keynote address entitled Metamethod with Dr. Angela Last. I'm Sydney Burns, and this session has been organized by the University of Stirling Interdisciplinary Research Network, the IRN, which is run by a small group of PhD students online via Teams. And our network has around 100 members comprising of researchers from different disciplines and universities across Scotland and the UK. The aim of our network is to share knowledge across disciplines and support each other to explore new and exciting ideas and methods related to interdisciplinary working. And information on how to join the network is available on our website, which I will post the link for later in the chat. The network is open to PhD students and early career researchers everywhere, and it's fully free to join and participate. Parts of this week-long series of events has been supported by the Stirling Fund. So we'd like to thank donors of the fund for helping to enhance the student experience through events like this one. And this session will be recorded and shared. We'll stop the recording after the presentation and before the discussion. Although I've been told there'll be bits of discussion here and there. So if you do choose to pipe in during the discussion, just be aware that you are recorded. And however, if you have a problem with that or any concerns about the recording, just drop me a private message. And I'll now briefly introduce you to our keynote speaker before passing over to her to give her talk. So Dr. Last has a background in human geography. Her work is located at the intersection of social science, science, and humanities. And her current writing project on cosmic descent looks at materialist attempts to move away from Eurocentrism. Her teaching includes courses on research communication, political ecology, and histories and philosophies of geography. She has co-edited a collection on interdisciplinary methods and blogs at Mutable Matter, I always say that wrong, .wordpress.com. We'll also put that link in the chat. I highly recommend you check it out. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Last to take the virtual floor.
Hi, I'm Angela, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and especially to talk about method, which is something that I've worked on a lot and been thinking about a lot in various different contexts, in my research, in my teaching, and also in my sort of performance of research, which kind of takes me to the method for this talk. As I mentioned to the organizers earlier, that I find it really difficult to concentrate on like keynotes that are read. So I'm going to not read my keynote, have it not quite like a workshop, because I know at the beginning was offered a choice between a workshop and a keynote, but to make it a bit more interactive. So we'll be asking some questions that you can answer in the chat, but you can also just keep them for yourself or keep them for if there's a question and answer session maybe afterwards or so, whatever you feel comfortable with. And the first question that I want to ask, I'm going to write it in the chat as well, is what do you consider part of your method? So what do you consider part of your method? Let's have like just a couple of minutes or so to think about that one. Theory, yes, that's a good one. I think often you have like the, especially with the literature, is often removed from the theoretical part, but it's kind of, yeah. Oh. Making. So we've got theory, we've got collaboration, making. I think these are really good answers, because I think often, like when we talk about method, it's kind of how we taught method in methods classes can sort of focus too much on certain technologies, techniques that we use, and sometimes they're being presented in an overly sort of neutral form, like they haven't got a historical legacy and things like that, and are not connected to sort of the wider remit of method. Because for me, method is always something that is really elastic. They can stretch to loads of different scales. You have the scale of your supervisors, for example, you have the scale of, your department, university management, the government. And these are all scales at the moment. I think there's a heightened sensation of how we relate to these different scales through the pandemic, also through the university strikes, something that I will be talking a bit about in this talk. This talk is influenced by a number of things, and one of them has also been conversations with PhD students, especially during my postdoc. I think when you're a postdoc, you're more approachable than a lecturer in many ways, because you're kind of a bit more neutral. And there was like two issues I got approached with, and one was that students were frustrated that the framework they're supposed to be working in, like the structure of the thesis, like literature review, methods, analysis. They felt it was a hindrance to their project because they wanted to weave the method through the project and just have chapters by themes, for example. And it wasn't like a sort of bad advice that the supervisors were giving them, because they wanted to be like protecting the students, in the viva of external influences and so on, that may have a different opinions than maybe even their supervisor. But some of these conversations were actually really useful for the students then to have with their supervisors. And I think they wanted me a bit of have a conversation that would clarify their argument that they were going to have. Been really useful to thinking about method and really sort of clarifying why they needed that particular method threaded through their thesis. And another thing was that an issue that I also noticed a lot doing external examining work, which is sometimes there's like a disconnect between, you start with a really great intro and you have, and that's not just with thesis, also with, any sort of senior academic work or more junior, is that, you have an aim, let's say, you want to you pursue a feminist or anti-racist method or something like this, and then your method that you use throughout the thesis clashes a bit because some of the things are not questioned sufficiently. Some of the methods that you're using, some of the canon that you're using, theory is, like, for example, like citational practices, or just sort of your whole sort of approach. And I think one of the questions that people have found helpful has been sort of, why did you want to undertake your research? And that's been a quite helpful question, both like during the pandemic, where a lot of projects got unsettled, but also, as I mentioned in my abstract, one prompt for this keynote has also been from my undergrads who were saying, well, you use method in a different way that we've been taught to think about method. And one student especially was struggling with some assignments, and it was an assignment in research communication. It was about racial abuse and racism. The student identified as mixed race, so personal influences on this. And part of me felt like she wasn't protecting herself enough. And I think this is a really important thing to think about, like in terms of method, like yeah, both, like, I mean, there's so many sort of layers that we need to take into consideration, including like the audiences we are directing our work at, but also the audiences we are not directing our work at, who are going to react to the work in some way, and how we kind of protect ourselves in these circumstances, and how we can also sort of mess with these expectations. An example, I mean, there's some things that I discussed with the students in that context was, for example, when you have, let's say, anti-racist work, there's so many ways in which you can perform that. You can perform that, through the citation projects, but also through the style in which you perform it. You could contrast authors such as Denise Ferreira da Silva. There's a book called A Global Theory of Race, towards a Global Theory of Race, where she used a really sort of clinical, almost like a caricature approach to race that kind of basically uses the same method against the people who are being racist. So and then you have other modes of working with pretty much the same material, like Nell Irvin Painter's History of White People, which uses humor to show the ridiculousness of, as well as the violence of the racist, especially scientific racism. And you have also like, again, a different performance which uses humor, but also like a visual register, which is Hito Steil's How Not to Be Seen. So there are many different ways in which you can perform method, but also how you can take different scales of method into consideration. And I think as scholars, but especially also as students, sometimes we feel like our work is like insignificant. It just doesn't connect to these wider scales because we're just like learning stuff, and especially when you like sort of grow older as an academic, you still feel like you're learning stuff, and you're you're just really confined to the scale that you're operating at. But I think especially at the moment with the pandemic, you notice, and also with what's going happening at the moment in government in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, you do notice the impact. And I know this is not, it sounds quite existential, and I know it's like a symposium method, but I think it does have an impact on method. And you will have noticed this surely with the pandemic, how you suddenly didn't have access to field sites, to books, to libraries, to your participants, and that changes your method, changes the interaction. You suddenly, well, you may still have the same participants, but you have them like virtually. They don't have the same kind of room dynamics. You can't do your sampling at a site that you wanted to get to as a scientist or as an archaeologist or something where a site really matters. But you also kind of feel the influence of the, in inverted commas, non-human, that as an additional sort of influence on your method. So yeah, I think this is yeah, and especially with the, so you kind of have to rethink certain relations, sort of what matters in your project, why you wanted to do this in the first place, which method actually sort of matter, so that it and maybe even the changed context will give you a different focus of for your project. So I think these have been really, they've been really traumatizing developments, but also really useful ones for some, at least for some people, when you had to make these alterations. I don't know, feel free to also put some comments on that in the chat. And with our students I'm going to go into the thing where also my affiliation wasn't mentioned. So I work at the University of Leicester, which is currently under a global boycott. And the reason why Leicester was singled out for a global boycott has a huge influence on our PhD students. And there are similar things happening also at other universities of which you may be part. So I think this is not just something that's confined to Leicester. I think there's a sort of wider importance. And the reason why Leicester is under global boycott is the way that the redundancies at Leicester were justified. So they were justified in mainly two registers. One was decolonization. So colleagues got redundancy notices because their subjects were being redundant and too white, like old languages. For example, ironically, the people who are under threat of redundancy are doing a lot of anti-racist work, which is kind of a slap in the face of students who've been activists in sort of decolonizing the curriculum, but also who are critical of the word decolonization in the first place, because if you really decolonize the university, then it probably wouldn't be there anymore. So that this is then used by management is kind of basically confirming that there's a lot of problems around there are a lot of problems around this concept, which is also hugely demoralizing. And on top of that, you have the justification the second justification for redundancies has been basically using critical methods, using critical social methods to do academic work. And so basically, when you're a student, your supervisor is being sacked because they're doing exactly what you're doing and what you believe in. And so yeah, do you have a future at this institution? Maybe not even just at this institution, but in the UK higher education, because obviously also tied to a lot of current politics and current economics. So there's been we had some really difficult conversations amongst the staff student community. So we have, for example, a weekly session called Critical and Creative Geographies lab group, which is people from this geography is already pretty interdisciplinary. It's mostly human geographers, but also some physical geographers, JS people. And it's been really hard to keep the morale, but also what we've been talking about, and I hope this has had some positive impact, is kind of the question, and again, this is a question that you may want to answer as well, is so who are you doing this for? So, and also, how does this relate to the different scales you're operating at? As you mentioned, you have kind of the scale of your supervisor that you may have like a brilliant relation with, whether your scale of the university management is absolutely, that relationship is absolutely awful. So, and then you have like some other layers going on, the government, the department, your peers are really important. And also, again, coming back to the question why you wanted to undertake this research and who you're doing it for. For example, when I was a PhD student, I thought it was the most selfish thing I've ever done, because I got paid to work on stuff that I was really interested in. I wanted to find out more about. And I did my PhD and my master's at the Open University. I was working as a carer and as a chef occasionally as well. And some people find that the stipend isn't really a lot, but if you worked in jobs that paid less than your PhD stipend and that you had to do overtime to get to that level, it's been was really amazing. And I thought like I wasn't worthy of all this stuff. So, but a lot of my peers had much more noble goals and were like advocating for certain communities or wanted to make a scientific intervention, like to do with like climate change, for example, or forestry. And they're saying, oh yeah, when something bad happens to me, I know what I'm doing this for, who I'm doing this for. Either I'm doing it for myself, I'm doing it for a particular community, I'm doing it to get a certain type of job or to become a politician or something like this. I think to ask some of these kind of more existential questions, but also that are actually not terribly existential if you think about them, because they just like are things that are embedded within our methods and our approach, I think can be really helpful. And I think in these times we also need something, if you don't, I'm not sure if the word is the correct one, but therapeutic. That sometimes it helps to think some of these things too, especially if you're in a crisis, either through external or internal factors. I've done a little zine on that as well, if anyone wants to have a copy. I haven't published it because I used some artists' illustrations on it. I really love the artist, but I don't think I would get the permission. So I just have it like distributing amongst sort of unofficially. I think the author that's most influential on me has been an author I've also been blogging about. And again, I'm happy to share any example. I know that you all from like different disciplines and do have different modes of performing research. And I've written a lot about geopolitics, and I've written about scientific stuff, I've written about teaching. So if anybody has trouble accessing stuff, please let me know. I post some links also there later. I just wanted to talk about this one sort of conversation I have with this one particular author. It partly also has to do with me being German, but also has to do with, I learned so much about reading this work that, and I think everyone who reads that author has a different relationship to him. So the author is Georges Perec, who's a French author. He's also a Jewish author, and his work was very much shaped with losing his family during the Holocaust. And so when I first read George Perec, I found him terribly annoying. I found him a bit like whimsical, and he was basically describing things in minute detail. You know, a room was on a desk. He was describing really mundane interactions that I was so bored by. But what he was really doing was asking questions about things, you know, how we categorize, how we sort things, what we consider worthy of inquiry. And I really like this definition of method as a mode of pursuing inquiry. And this mode is really important because it's really expansive, but also what decides what's an inquiry. And there's so many things that can sort of spin off from there. And I first didn't get him, and then the more I read him, the more I got him, and I'm glad I stuck with this. There's a book called Species of Space, which is a collection of some of his work. And there's, for example, every like nerdy geographical thing where he talks about writing your address down, not as a, you know, your house number, your street, your postcode, but in other ways. Like, for example, you have latitude and longitude. Today you have a group of people who call themselves What Three Words, the science people may know them, who like divide the globe into 3 by 3 meter squares, give them 3 random words. And, you know, because a lot of people don't have an address on this planet, or when you have disaster aid, you may want to drop some parcels somewhere. You know, this is what the system was invented for, and it sounds really bizarre, but it, you know, it's a system that's being implemented. Same with, you know, how did longitude and latitude actually get, you know, how did they come into being? The Greenwich mean was a political decision. If you have a kilo, that's just some random lump of rock. I mean, okay, this is maybe a bit more complicated, but you know, these things that we take as measurements that, you know, scientific measurements, other sort of categories that have been established for a long time, we sometimes don't question them enough, and how they've been historically shaped and what that might mean for the present. Yeah, so there's some really interesting experiments in that work that look at different scales, but also time, how things move through time and how things become habits. And sometimes it is useful to look at habits. And I think the most drastic example he has in that book is a memo about the appropriate amount of greenery around a concentration camp oven. So, you know, this is like something that also Hannah Arendt talked about in terms of, sort of the banality of evil, that, you know, sometimes we just follow something. And I think this is why I find this work interesting is, you know, people follow certain things that are actually really sort of inhuman in an everyday manner. And there may be discomfort with it, but they're still being followed. And I think this, it's really important to, when we have this discomfort, to inquire further. Yeah, so, and I think one of the questions that I also want to ask, and I can help, I think, is sort of what do you want your method to do? I think this can be a really useful question. Basically, the 3 questions I had for this talk was, so what do you consider a part of your method? That's, I think, a useful question to see sort of what scales you're currently sort of operating at and thinking with, and also experiencing, and that you may not, or may not have thought about. I mean, a lot of the, I think methods teaching today is a lot more expansive than it was when I got trained, like taking, for example, ethics into account as well. Although, again, it shows up some issues, the way it's being performed in ethics forms. and why you want to undertake your research, I think can be useful to keep you on track also in terms of your like who your audience is, who you're doing it for, and who you're doing it for is also basically the next question I think is also useful for basically staying sane doing a PhD on one hand, but and especially when things are happening, the outside influences that are beyond your control. But I think they also relate to how you approach your method, and also how you can protect yourself and others. So I think this question, basically what I want to get at is that to keep basically track of the scales at which you're operating, because these scales often we underestimate the way in which we're embedded in these scales and our methods. And we know that methods have changed over time, both in the sciences and humanities. I mean, a lot of scientists are really embarrassed about stuff that's happened in the past with sort of, in Europe, for example, with the church influence, that you couldn't research certain things or couldn't even think things because you were in a certain ideological framework. And no matter whether, like, I don't know, people in China, for example, had a very different idea about the universe, and this couldn't be computed for a long time. And then it probably also, when there was a connection made, over time, this kind of connection got a bit whitewashed. There's been reading some interesting stuff around sort of European scientific revolution and other sort of geographical influences. So I think it is really important to keep these connections and scales in mind, but also your place within them, because I feel like we often underestimate as of our importance because we're being kind of humble, or just that's basically what I wanted to talk about, and a few things that I didn't quite get to, but I think I would like to just have a bit of a conversation about that.
Great. I think maybe at this point we can stop the recording then and then go into a bit of a discussion. Is that